Morning, guys. It is Monday morning, March 30th. Seems like March has been forever, but we're almost done with it. And so today is our second week, starts our second week of distance learning. We're going to start talking today about Kennedy, Johnson, and Vietnam. Um, I was not able to print out my frame routine here in the format that I wanted it to. I hope you're able to, but if not, I'm taking my notes just on paper here. So my key topic is Kennedy, Johnson, and Vietnam is about how America became involved in Southeast Asia. Okay. And, feel free to pause the video when I'm showing you my notes so that you can get your notes taken down. Okay, America and the war in Indochina. Situated far away in Southeast Asia, Vietnam did not attract significant American attention until the 1960s. Television news shows rarely mentioned it, and most Americans could not locate it on a map. But over a span of more than 10 years, the United States sent several million soldiers to fight in Vietnam. America's involvement in Vietnam had roots in European colonialism, Cold War politics, and Vietnamese calls for national independence. So bear in mind, this is going to have everything in the world to do with France and France's colonial ambitions, which had been short-circuited by First World War I, but then particularly World War II when Japan took over Vietnam and kicked the French out. After World War II is over, the French are going to want to come back in and reestablish colonial dominance, but in the meantime, some real nationalist fervor has taken hold in Vietnam. They don't want the French there anymore. They want them out. They want a free and independent country away from the colonialism of the French. Okay. In the 1800s, French military forces established control over Indochina, a peninsula in Southeast Asia that includes the modern countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Slightly larger than the state of Texas, Indochina included almost 27 million people by the end of World War II. French colonial officials ruled Vietnam with an iron fist. They transplanted French laws into Vietnam and imposed high taxes. French business people acquired large rice and rubber plantations and controlled the mineral wealth of the country. Some Vietnamese, especially wealthier members of society, benefited from Western culture and technology. Many others, however, were impoverished by colonialism. Okay, first main idea for today is French control. I'm hoping that this isn't backwards, that you can see this actually the way it's supposed to be. First main idea, French Indochina in the 1800s. So France actually pretty much invaded and colonialized Indochina and Vietnam in particular by the 1800s. They had been there for a while by the end of World War II, and most of the Vietnamese were pretty sick of them by that point as well. In large part because colonialism impoverished most of the country. Okay. Some Vietnamese rebelled against France's exploitative rule. Ho Chi Minh, we're going to talk about him in a minute, became the most important voice demanding independence for Vietnam. Born in 1890, Ho became involved in anti-French organizations as a young man and fled Vietnam in 1912. He traveled the world visiting American ports and living periodically in London, Paris, and Moscow. During his 30-year absence, Ho constantly thought and wrote about Vietnam, and he searched for Westerners who would support his plans for Vietnamese independence. Ho embraced communism, and eventually Soviet communists rallied to his cause. Okay. So we've got this situation where, bear in mind that communism, as it was originally envisioned by Marx, was anti-colonial. They wanted one of the main ideas of communism was to defeat all colonial powers around the world, which at the time primarily meant Great Britain, France, Russia, to a lesser extent Germany, but also the United States. The United States also had some territorial ambitions by the end of the 1800s, the Philippines, in Cuba, and places like that. And communism really wanted to root out that colonialism. And so when you get nationalist tendencies, like in Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh, uh, those tendencies are going to kind of naturally be drawn to communism because they have an affinity in that anti-colonialism aspect. Okay, during World War II, France had undermined French control over Japan had undermined French control over Vietnam. But when the conflict ended, France reasserted its colonial aims there. France's problem, however, was that colonialism was a dying institution. World War II had strengthened nationalist movements while weakening the economic and military positions of traditional European powers. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh clamored for independence as France struggled to maintain its dwindling global power. Okay, so World War II weakened colonial powers and strengthened nationalism. So the traditional European powers that have established colonies over the world have been the ones that have primarily taken it on the chin through two world wars, really, but especially by the end of World War II. And a lot of places that have been, in the past, for the past couple centuries, colonized by these powers have started really clamoring for their independence, particularly with Great Britain. That's going to happen in India. And Indian independence happens, I believe, in the 1940s. We'll get to that in a little bit, late 1940s, which is why the Brits no longer control India. But this is what Ho Chi Minh's trying to achieve in Vietnam. This is going to put the U.S. in kind of a bind because with President Truman, you've got two competing goals here, and we'll talk about that now. Meanwhile, the United States faced a difficult decision. On the one hand, it supported decolonization. Okay, America's always been a little getting an incoming call. Sorry. America's always been a little hypocritical about colonization because we, kind of by our own lights, by our own professed ideals, we're really, or should be, anti-colonial, but we also have our own, always have had our own colonial ambitions. And in fact, that's basically how we took over what we now think of as the West from Oklahoma westward, by colonizing the areas where Native Americans were living at the time and still are living. So on the one hand, the U.S. supported decolonization. On the other hand, America wanted France as an ally in its Cold War effort to contain the Soviet Union. President Harry S. Truman believed that if he supported Vietnamese independence, he would weaken anti-communist forces in France. So, to ensure a strong anti-communist Western Europe, Truman sacrificed his own anti-colonial sentiments. So, with the U.S., we have support for decolonization versus the urge to have French support against the communists. And I'm going to try to get this here. So this is our fourth bullet point right here for this main idea. So this is the dilemma that Truman has, which is that he wants to support essentially freedom movements, nationalist, anti-colonial movements around the world, but if he does that in Vietnam, he's afraid he's going to lose the support of the French in holding back communism. And here we have the domino theory really coming into play. Okay, Vietnam thus became a pawn in Cold War politics. To ensure French support in the Cold War, Truman agreed to aid France's efforts to regain control over Vietnam. After communist forces won the Civil War in China in 1949, America increased its aid to the French in Vietnam. Truman did not want to see another communist victory in Asia. Why? Because of the domino theory. Between 1950 and 1954, the United States contributed $2.6 billion to France's war efforts. Containing Ho Chi Minh's Communist Viet Minh, an abbreviation of the League for the Independence of Vietnam, became a national priority. Okay, so let's talk about Ho Chi Minh a little bit. This was the nationalist Vietnamese leader who'd been born in 1890, known as Ho, H-O. Go ahead and get that out of your systems. Okay, so next main idea, Ho Chi Minh, Ho, Chiminh. Okay, Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist. In other words, he wanted an independent and free Vietnam. And remember, here's where the communist doctrine of anti-colonialism is really going to come into play, because Ho Chi Minh travels around for 30 years looking for friends, looking for Westerners who will support his idea of a free and independent Vietnam. Doesn't find any except among the communist community. So he embraces communism and then goes back to Vietnam after the Japanese are kicked out in order to fight for Vietnamese independence as a communist leader. So he embraced communism. Second bullet point, and remember that communism is anti-colonial, which is, that jibes perfectly with what Ho wants to do. Okay. So we get into the domino theory. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower took office in early 1953, he continued Truman's policies toward Vietnam. He sent monetary aid to the French, arguing that by battling Ho Chi Minh, they were containing the spread of communism. Eisenhower told a journalist that the fight in Vietnam involved more than the future of just one country. Okay, here's the big quote. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influence. Domino theory was the idea that if Vietnam fell to communism, its closest neighbors would follow. This, in turn, would threaten Japan, the Philippines, and Australia. In short, stopping the communists in Vietnam was important to the protection of the entire region. So the U.S. has made its choice here to, instead of, trying to get this in the frame, so third bullet point, U.S. choice to fight communism. So instead of the idea of fighting colonialism or supporting freedom fighters anywhere in the world, we're going to cast our lot very firmly behind the idea of defeating or containing communism. And so it is the domino theory that is going to, over time, and remember, Eisenhower and the domino theory, this is in the 1950s. American involvement in Vietnam isn't going to end until 1973. So this is a process of decades here. But the domino theory is what's going to deepen American involvement in Vietnam and eventually lead to the deaths of 50,000 plus American troops in that country. All right, so this is the end of the lecture for Monday, April 30th, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.